Bombay, September 15th, 1973. The day after his arrival, Srila Prabhupada met with Mrs. N's solicitors and heard their offers. The situation had begun to look hopeful, and yet the conclusion eluded them. Mrs. N had become changed by the public reaction to her attempt to demolish the temple. If Prabhupada would pay the full balance of 12 lakhs of rupees for the land in one payment, she told her lawyer she would agree. Prabhupada was agreeable, but did not want to arrange to collect his money until he was certain that Mrs. N was actually serious. Mr. Ashnani, a Bombay lawyer and ISKCON Life member, regularly met with Mrs. N, persuading her to cooperate with Prabhupada. Her lawyers concurred, yet after Prabhupada had been to Bombay for several weeks, no meeting with Mrs. N had taken place. Once Mr. Ashnani went to bring Mrs. N to meet with Prabhupada, but she was not feeling well. Day after day, Mr. Ashnani would tell Prabhupada, Mrs. N will come tomorrow. Prabhupada became disappointed at the procrastination, and seeing this, his secretary told Mr. Ashnani that although they knew he meant well, they were inclined to have their own lawyers handle the case. Mr. Ashnani asked for another 48 hours to close the deal and execute the conveyance. Mrs. N was at her other home, where she had just recovered from her illness. When Mr. Ashnani visited, Mataji, he begged, my Guru Maharaj is leaving tomorrow. If you don't come tonight, the problem with the land will go on another year. Mrs. N agreed. And around 9 p.m., she and Mr. Ashnani arrived at the home of Mr. Bhogilal Patel, where Srila Prabhupada was holding a program of kirtan and Bhagavad discourses. Prabhupada was on the roof preparing to lecture, but hearing that Mrs. N had arrived, he interrupted the meeting and came down to his room to talk with her. They talked briefly, and Prabhupada excused himself and returned to the roof to lecture. Around midnight, he returned to his room again. Mrs. N was still waiting. She burst into tears and bowed at Prabhupada's feet. I'm sorry for everything I've done, she sobbed. Please forgive me. She promised to do whatever Prabhupada wanted. Prabhupada looked at her compassionately and understood her heart. You are just like my daughter, he said. Don't worry. I will take care of you. I will see to all of your needs for the rest of your life. And Prabhupada said he still accepted the very terms she had proposed, that he pay the remaining balance of 12 lakhs plus 50,000 rupees compensation for the delay. Prabhupada and Mrs. N had to set November 1st as a tentative deadline for the final signing of the conveyance. Shortly after their meeting, Prabhupada moved from Bhogilal Patel's to the house of Mr. Sept, where working intensely, he tackled the remaining problems, such as getting C Company to withdraw their claim. Next, he moved to the home of Mr. C.M. Katao, just 2 blocks from Hare Krishna land, where he lived in a summer cottage, a simple structure with a bamboo frame and chatai walls. Usually, conveyances had to be signed in the presence of the city registrar at his office downtown. But Mr. Ashnani arranged for the registrar to come to Prabhupada's place. At 6:30 in the evening, Srila Prabhupada was seated at his low desk between two windows, his back against the wall. Mrs. N and her lawyer, the registrar, Mr. Ashnani, Mr. and Mrs. Sethi, and about 8 devotees were present, and the full room grew warm and stuffy. Mrs. N sat at Prabhupada's right as the registrar prepared the papers for signing. Srila Prabhupada sat gravely. The room was silent, except for the sound of papers rustling from a pen's scratching. Preparing and signing the conveyance papers took more than 20 minutes. Srila Prabhupada paid Mrs. N, who then signed the conveyance. The land was legally ISKCON's. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. This lawyer, Mr. Ashnani, he went on to do other services for ISKCON. In those early days, there were no Indian devotees. There were only foreigners, except for a few, Haridas. Few, very few. Indian devotees weren't really joining. And maybe because, there was this, I don't know, Dum or a Dum movie. You ever saw that? Huh? What was it? Anand, some producer, huh? Devanand, he lived right. Made this stupid movie and accusing the devotees of being drug addicts and this and that. And everywhere we went around, people would see us and they'd say, Hare Krishna Hare Rama, Dhamma Dam. But we never mind because at least they were chanting Hare Krishna, right? So they weren't joining. Not many were coming and joining. And so they, in order for devotees to stay here who were foreigners, especially for Americans, there was a big problem for visas. And I remember Mr. Ashnani would always, he'd help the foreign devotees. There was a devotee here, an Indian devotee. He was from Tamil Nadu. His name was Prasannatma. He's living in Vrindavan now. And, he would liaison with Mr. Ashnani, and they would figure out various ways to, work with the foreign registration office so that the foreign devotees could stay in India. And British devotees didn't have a problem. There was still this Commonwealth. The rule was that if you had a Commonwealth passport, you know what a Commonwealth passport is? Right, there was the Commonwealth. After India became independent, they were still part of the British Commonwealth, right? So if you had a Commonwealth passport, you could stay in India without a visa. And that included the devotees from UK. So they were okay. But other devotees, especially the Americans, and most of the devotees that were coming in those days to India were from America, like Yuraj Swami was from America. And Sridhar Swami could stay because he wasn't from America. Sridhar Swami was from? Sridhar Swami was from Croatia. Kya baat karte hai? He was Canadian. We say in America it was Canuck. We called Canadians Canucks. But he was Canadian. So he could stay. He didn't have a problem. But other devotees had a problem. And this Ashnani, right up until he left this world, he always came forward to help the devotees. It's such a complicated thing sometimes. I remember I got stuck, I had an American passport. I didn't have a visa. I was stuck in between Nepal and India. Neither I could stay in Nepal, neither I could stay in India. It was I remember in the middle of the night I was crossing a river around the border check of Nepal to come into India. And then for a while I had no visa at all, but Mr. Ashnani, he did some, some magic down there at the FRO, and that everything somehow or another got regularized. So these persons who came in contact with Srila Prabhupada, they continued their connection somehow. They weren't chanting Hare Krishna. Mr. Ashnani didn't chant Hare Krishna. No way. I don't know what he did. But he somehow or another had this bhava that he wanted to do something for Prabhupada. Even after Prabhupada left, he wanted to help the devotees. So that Krishna takes into account. And certainly they get, because Prabhupada mentions clearly in Chaitanya Charitamrita that those persons who support this movement, right, they get the same benefit as the full-time workers in the movement, right? So Mr. Ashnani, in that way, I'm sure he was certainly benefited. Giriraj. The room was hushed during the signing, and everyone felt as if a momentous event was taking place, just as if two great world powers were signing a treaty. And after Mrs. N signed the document, everyone silently watched the papers being passed. She started to cry. Tamal Krishna Goswami quietly asked her why she was crying. And Mrs. N replied that just that day, Mr. Matar had come and told her he had found a buyer for the land for many more lakhs than we were paying. Actually, as we were watching Mrs. N, we were thinking that she must be remembering all the events that had taken place, the wrongs that she had done, the death of her husband. It was very intense, like a combination of months, the combination of months of struggling. So, for Prabhupada, the devotees, and Prabhupada's well-wishers, their dreams and desires and efforts over the past many years were being fulfilled. Srila Prabhupada asked that the devotees inform the newspapers, and he invited everyone into the hall outside the room for a feast. Mats were rolled out in 2 lines, and devotees brought leaf plates and placed them in front of everyone. The devotees began serving the various dishes to the 2 rows of seated guests. Prabhupada was standing. Now let us start, he said, as he is supervising the serving. The devotees had prepared several courses: rice, dal, many varieties of pakoras, such as potato, cauliflower, and eggplant, potato sabji, wet cauliflower sabji, poppers, burfi, ladus, chum chum, a milk sweet, vermicelli kheer, halava, and a lime drink. It was a festive and happy occasion. Mrs. Warrior, a tenant of Hare Krishna land, the devotees, Mrs. Warrior had in the back there were 27 tenants before that lived in Hare Krishna land. We had 27 tenants. Now Mr. Nair, the reason why he became prominent, the reason why he had money, he could buy this land, he owned a newspaper called Free Press Journal, which was a pretty prominent, it's still going on, but that time was kind of a prominent newspaper. And what happened was that in India, they didn't make in those days newsprint. All the newspapers, all the, the Times of India, all these, they were printed on imported newsprint from Finland. Okay, Finland is a country in Northern Europe, and they make newsprint. They make all different kinds of paper, but they're famous for newsprint. So this is in the year about 1939, right? Mr. Nair used to import newsprint from Finland. So what happened was that he had imported a whole shipload of newsprint, and it was government controlled. Everything was government controlled in those days, from Finland. And when he got his consignment of this whole shipload of newsprint, the war between England and Germany started, 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and immediately Britain declared war on Germany. And Finland was aligned with Germany. So they also were at war with England. It means you're at war with India also, because England owned India. So he never had to pay for that whole shipload of newsprint. And he became very wealthy that way. And he bought this land. And on this land, he had many coconut trees, lots of coconut trees. That's why there are 5, how many wells? 4 or 5? 4 wells. One well was where the tree is that just fell down. One well is behind the Gurukul. One well, they call it the Prajalpa well, because all the devotees used to sit there and talk, right? Prajalpa Kua. And where was the 4th one? Okay, so there are 4 wells. And he used those wells to irrigate the coconuts. Right? And that was one business he had here, irrigate the coconut trees. But he had another business. Mr. Nair was keeping horses here. And those horses would go every day to Juhu Beach, because a lot of people came to Juhu Beach for enjoyment, right? All of these buildings that you see, all the way up to Juhu Beach, in those days weren't there. The only thing that was there was a couple of Chetai huts and that Devi temple. You know, the little pond where all the turtles live? Right in front of that, there's the only thing all the way to Juhu Beach that was there in those days. Everything else was coconut trees. This place had so many coconut trees. But the horses, he would take the horses, you know, his boys would take him to Juhu Beach, and they would charge money for rides in the back. So then Air India was becoming prominent airline, and the airport was in Santa Cruz. So more and more workers were, you know, like pilots and engineers, maintenance crews. They needed a place to live. So what Mr. Nair did was he built in the back flats, ground plus 1, right? And there were A building, B building, C building, D building, E building, F building, 6 buildings, right? Ground plus 1, and they had flats. So he was renting out those flats to the people that worked, you know, at the airlines. There was Mr. Patak, Mr. Shenoy, so many of them, but almost all of them. The Acharya, Padmanabha Acharya, he didn't work at the airlines. He was a politician. But Vittal Acharya was a pilot. And so Mr. Nair had all these flats there. That's another way that he was earning money from this property. So he was earning money from the property in various ways. And also illegal ways too. They had some kind of, what do they call that? Homemade liquor? Daru. Something they were making here, homemade liquor, and they were selling it also out of this place. So there were some illegal activities going on too. It was right here where the temple is, I think, that was going on. So Mr. Nair never intended that Srila Prabhupada get this land. He had already taken money from 2 different people. But when the people went to get permissions and things like that to build, they couldn't get it. And they lost their money, and they just gave up dealing with Mr. Nair. But what Mr. Nair didn't calculate is that now he thought that these are foreigners and I can easily cheat them. And in those days, many people did easily cheat the foreigners. You know, they would come back from shopping and they would tell Prabhupada, you know, he said, okay, how much you paid for this? And they'd tell, right? And he'd say, so what do you think about this price? And the devotee would say, oh, it's very cheap, very cheap. And Prabhupada would tell him, you paid 5 times more than what this is worth. Right? They're thinking very cheap, but they paid 5 times more. And Prabhupada said, you're all damn cheap babas. Damn cheap babas. That's what he called. So the devotees weren't very expert at anything, really. And Srila Prabhupada was expert at everything. I mean, you can imagine Srila Prabhupada's surprise. He knew the vision for this temple, but none of the devotees did. They were living in Akash Ganga. They were making life members. In those days, life membership was 1,111 rupees, right? So, they were making so many members. They do an evening program, and they would make 10 life members at the evening program. And that was all going on downtown from Akash Ganga. But yet Prabhupada had bought this land. And like I said, in those days, this was way out. This was nowhere, right? Yet Prabhupada knew that what would happen. He knew that the importance of this land. The devotees didn't understand it. When he told them, okay, now we're going to move Radharas Bihari out to the land, nobody liked that, right? Because their preaching was downtown. So they'd have to somehow or another get over to, the Viliparle train station was the closest one, then take a train to go downtown. In those days, you could get in the trains, and though there wasn't so much public, you could get in the train. Nowadays, you can't even get in the train. But Prabhupada insisted, and so the devotees moved out here to Hare Krishna land. There were no facilities, nowhere to live. They had to live in chetai huts. And in those days, there were a lot of rats here. Now, I've seen rats before, but I've never seen rats as big as the rats here in Hare Krishna land. Itna bada rat. Bahut bada chua. And we had cats, right? But the cats were afraid of the rats. They were so big. Big, huge rats, right? Radha Krishna knows. You never seen rats so big. They were huge. So the devotees had to live in those kind of situations. Mosquitoes, rats, no place to live. Eventually, after Mrs. Nair could sell the property and finalize the deal, then on the top of the 6 buildings, actually 5 buildings, they made one more floor. So there's ground plus 1, and then they made one more floor, and that was ISKCON Juhu. Those 5 buildings, one extension on every building. It's probably about 5,000 square feet. That's where the devotees lived. That's where the accounts department was. That's where the office was. That's where the kitchen was. That's where everything was in those buildings. And this was under construction. Shri Shri Radha Rasri Hare Ki. Shri Shri Gaur Nitai Sitaram Lakshman Hanuman Ki. So, Mrs. Boyer, the devotees were all saying Jai after the signing, and all of them were very happy. Then Prabhupada gave a lecture about the Bombay project. he gave an idea to all the people of how it would be all marble. There wouldn't be a single thing that wasn't built from marble. Some were asking how it would be possible for everything to be marble. And Prabhupada explained that it was possible and it could be done. He was visualizing the project, and everyone was thrilled to hear the way he was describing it. It would be like one of the 7 wonders of the world. People would be attracted from all over to come and see it. It would be a landmark in Bombay. Prabhupada explained the whole project as if he saw it in his mind's eye. And he said that after it was constructed, it will be more than what we could visualize, It will be fantastic. After the late feast, everyone had departed. Prabhupada returned to his room, and leaning back on his desk, he exclaimed, "It was a good fight." It was a good fight. So Srila Prabhupada had to struggle with Mr. Nair. He had to struggle with the municipality. He had to struggle with the devotees, because they were thinking of Akash Ganga, a nice apartment in downtown Bombay where they were making life members, as opposed to the rat-infested mosquito place, right? But Prabhupada persisted. But he said later on that, or during the fight, he said that actually it's not our business as Vaishnavas to get into fighting. That's not, we could just walk away from the fight, right? He said that because Lord Krishna was staying here, because Radharas Bihari was already here on the land, and if Radharas Bihari went away, it would be a big insult to them if they had to leave. He said, therefore I fought, right? So a devotee is like that. The devotee on his own accord, he'll never get in a fight. He'll walk away. Because devotees don't have false egos, right? But for the pleasure of Krishna, for Krishna's reputation, then he'll fight. We see that in the life of Srila Prabhupada. On his own accord, he wasn't interested in anything for himself, but for spreading Krishna consciousness, for the pleasure of Krishna, for the spreading of Krishna's fame, then he was ready to do anything, right? I remember at the end, when Srila Prabhupada was sick, just before he left, he said, I want to go around Govardhan Hill. He couldn't walk, couldn't even walk, he was so sick. But he said, I want to go around Govardhan Hill, because Govardhan Puja was coming. And he told Lokanath Swami, bring one bullock cart. And, he told a story about how in the old days, going from Mayapur to Calcutta, right? They would throw a mattress in the back of a bullock cart, and then they would take rest at night, and the bullock would go and go and go, and in the morning they would be in Calcutta. Nowadays, if you take the trip from Calcutta to Mayapur in a vehicle, right? It's such a dangerous thing. It's a small road, and I remember when I first came to India, we took a flight, all the devotees together, to Delhi. We spent one night in Delhi and then came to Calcutta. That's because in those days, the Calcutta airport the runway could not handle the 747s. They could only handle the smaller jets. So we had to come to Delhi first, then Delhi to Calcutta by, I think it was a 707 or something. And then we'd spend one night in Albert Road, right? And the next day by bus out to Mayapur. So this is my first time in India. I had never been even out of practically the city I lived in. And once I went to Chicago. I was just 20 years old, right? So we got in this bus and we're going out to Mayapur, and I got a seat in the front. And it was good because, you know, Indian buses, there's not much room between this seat and this seat. It's for shorter people. And so I got a seat in the front where my legs, there was no seat in front of me, right? But it was a mistake because the driver, when he was driving, you know, he would go around another truck or something that was going slower, and then another vehicle would be coming this way, and just in time he would get back over into the other lane. And I had never seen that before, you know. You know, I had friends that used to, they would play a game of chicken. It was called chicken. They would drive at each other, and whoever would turn over, you know, who would get out of the way first, he was a chicken. Right? So they play a game of chicken. But here, this driver, every minute he was playing a game of chicken. So it was kind of a, it was a culture shock, very big culture shock. But here in Hare Krishna land, Srila Prabhupada had this vision. And I remember being in America, and the BBT would send out a newsletter every month. And they had a drawing, actually, of the guest house. Srila Prabhupada's original intention was for a much higher guest house. I think there was like 10 floors or something. But due to being near the airport, the regulation was that you could only have these many floors. But that was the information that came to us in America. We were going out on Sankirtan, selling books, and for every book that we sold, we knew that, you know, some portion of that money was going to go to help build the project in Bombay, because it was Prabhupada's vision. And I think the devotees, Prabhupada had already, by that time, had already built Vrindavan. Krishna Balaram Temple was opened in '75. And then his next project was Bombay. But the devotees in Mayapur were thinking, well, why Bombay? You should build Mayapur first. Right? But the reason was that Srila Prabhupada was trying to establish ISKCON and as an authorized religious movement, spiritual movement, religious movement. And there was so much anti-propaganda against ISKCON in those days that ISKCON is a CIA, right? It came also in the parliament. The ISKCON is part of the CIA. And Prabhupada said, well, who in the CIA is going to get up at 3:30 in the morning and go every day to Mangalar? CIA will do that. This is an authorized movement. So he wanted to establish ISKCON as authorized. And also he had an attraction for Bombay because he had lived here before as a householder. He used to visit regularly. He had a chemical concern. So down on Princess Street, still all those shops are there where they sell various kinds of chemicals. So for his medicines that he was making, he worked for one other Bengali gentleman, but then he started his own chemical concern, and he needed to get those supplies from Bombay, so he would visit regularly. And he would regularly meet the devotees from the Gaudiya Math that were preaching here. Right? And in fact, Srila Prabhupada helped them get a place. It was a rented place they had on Grant Road. The Gaudiya Math, Bombay Gaudiya Math was in Grant Road. Subsequently, they shifted to Bandra. But at that time, Srila Prabhupada, and they approached Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, the Gaudiya Math devotees, and they said, why don't you have ask Abhay Babu to be in charge of the Grant Road Gaudiya Mutt. You know, that time he was a householder. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said, no, not now. In time, he will do everything. That was the reply. And we could understand that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur knew that what Srila Prabhupada would accomplish and when he would accomplish it. Because pure devotees of the Lord, they're Trikalagya, they see the future. You know, we don't see the future just like the devotees. They thought, what is this Hare Krishna land? We should be in Akash Ganga. Right? But Prabhupada could see. Same way in Bhubaneswar. I remember the first time I went to Bhubaneswar, you know, he had Gaur Govinda Maharaj out there living in a hut. And so myself and some other devotees, we took a train to Bhubaneswar, and we went to go to visit Gaur Govinda Maharaj out in the ISKCON property. I think he called it Hare Krishna land also. But it was so far out of town that no rickshawala wanted to even go there. Because if he went there, he wouldn't be able to get a rickshaw back. You know, he wouldn't be able to get a fare to come back into the town of Bhubaneswar. But now, if you see that Bhubaneswar temple, it's right in the heart of the city. The whole city has grown around it. You know, the national highway, which is expanded right there. So Prabhupada could see the future and see how things would develop. He knew. This is the nature, as Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur knew that Srila Prabhupada was going to do some amazing things to spread Krishna consciousness. Later, Prabhupada would cite the story of the fight for the Bombay land as evidence that a person in Krishna consciousness has no problems. Now we have spent in Bombay 18 to 20 lakhs of rupees, he said, months later, while on tour in Europe. The property is actually worth 50 lakhs. People are surprised, and some of them are envious. But if you will come, you will find that it is very, very fine place. It's just like a paradise garden, 20,000 square yards, and we have got 6 buildings. So actually, when we come to Krishna consciousness, there are no problems. Surely the land was full of potential, but how could he say there were no problems? No problems meant that Srila Prabhupada saw how Krishna personally arranged things for his devotees. When he had needed money, it came. The original down payment that Srila Prabhupada made he didn't have that money. In India, there was no money. Even though they were making life members, still there were expenditures. So it was like one day it would come, the next day it would be spent. So in between there was no money. So how was he going to pay so many lakhs of rupees to Mr. Nair? Even if it was a cheap price, he still needed the money. So what Srila Prabhupada did was, the New York temple was living in Brooklyn, and on Henry Street, in a house. It was a house actually, but a big house. And I think they had 2 of them. But they wanted to move to Manhattan for a bigger place, because Manhattan is where everything is in New York. I mean, if you have an office in Brooklyn, nobody cares. But if you have an office in Manhattan, it's like having an office in Kolaba, or what do they call that place? Or Mittelbai Chambers, the reclamation area, what do they call that? Anyway, it's a prestigious place down south. So the devotees wanted to shift from Henry Street to Manhattan. And they were even looking at a place on 55th Street. And they had saved some money to do that. But Prabhupada called up Gopijana Ballabha, who was the temple president, and he said, how much money you have? And he said, I have this much money. And Prabhupada said, send it to India. And with that money, he bought this Hare Krishna land. Of course, later on, New York arranged some other money, and they were able to buy a skyscraper building on 55th Street in Manhattan. So there's no problem in Krishna consciousness. If you want to do something for the pleasure of Krishna, Krishna will make the arrangement. Not that you don't work, you work. But a devotee sees how, although he's working for a particular goal because he's trying to please Krishna, Krishna is the actual one that arranged. There may be so many problems that you see, but in the end you realize there's no problem because Krishna made all the arrangements. When he had needed money, it had come in an amount that ordinarily would have been impossible to collect, and the formidable opposition Krishna had removed. Prabhupada had no organized means of income and little political influence to fight persons like Mr. and Mrs. Nair. But because he was surrendered to Krishna, there was no problem. All the problems of the world were created by the non-devotees who defied the injunctions of the Supreme. Anyone who's in Bhakti Yoga, Prabhupada said, he can understand that all problems are solved, we can practically see. The secret to success is to do things not on your own accord. If you do things for your own aggrandizement, whatever it is, it will be a failure. Wholesale failure. But if you do things on account of Krishna, for the pleasure of Krishna, it will always be a success. And yet, he had to tolerate the problems created by the non-devotees. For almost 2 years, he had to struggle to secure the land for Krishna's service. Whether in Bombay or elsewhere, he had to worry over how to help his inexperienced disciples. They didn't know Jack. They had no idea. They were hippies. They didn't know what was to be done, what was not to be done. The only senior person in the whole movement was Srila Prabhupada. You can imagine. The whole organization were just kids. Only one person experienced, Prabhupada. Whether in Bombay or elsewhere, he had to worry over how to help his inexperienced disciples who were ill-equipped to handle the ploys of the opposing party. Ploy means cunningness, cunning scheme, right? To take advantage of someone, the ploys. I remember when I first became president. You know, I was inexperienced. I didn't know that much about what was happening in India, but somehow I became president. I think Giriraj Swami became a GBC, and Sridhar Swami became a regional secretary, and I became the president. We were all just kind of moving up, right? This was in 1984, I believe. So, you know, we had tenants, and some of the tenants lived out in the back. There was these small shed-like things, asbestos roof. And when Mr. Nair was building the apartments, the people that worked at Air India, they wanted to come and stay here. So where he was keeping his horses, he moved out the horses and turned the horse barn into small rooms for his tenants, his future tenants, right? So after those apartments were built and the people that worked at Air India, they moved into the apartments, he rented out those outhouses that used to be a horse barn to other people. And they were paying some rent. So some of them came to me, I was friendly with them, and some of them came to me and said, listen, why don't you let us apply for electric meters? Because right now, all the electricity is coming from your bill. You know, you're paying the bill for our electricity. So why don't you just let us get meters? And that way, we'll pay our own electric bill and the temple will save money. Now, being inexperienced, I thought that sounded like a pretty good idea. But actually, what happened is by allowing them to get a meter, they had more rights to the place than just ordinary renters. They knew that, but I didn't know that, right? But anyway, gradually we learned things. And you talk about another big struggle was to remove the tenants from Hare Krishna land. You know, there's part one of the story, how Prabhupada got the property from Mr. Nair, but part two of the story is how we were able to remove all the tenants from Hare Krishna land. And I mean, and some of them were nice, but some of them were a pain in the you know what. Like on Sunday, we'd have so many members and guests that would come to Hare Krishna land. And if they parked their car in front of one of the tenants' house, they would come and let the air out of the tire of our guest. And one time, one of the tenants let the air out of the tire of Krishna Murari. Krishna Murari Prabhu is a Sankirtan devotee. He hasn't been around, maybe you don't know him so well, but there was a big fight between that tenant and Krishna Murari over letting the air out of his tires. So many things, the tenants, there was a lot of tension. Not everyone, like Mrs. Warrior, she was always okay, but with many of the others, there were a lot of tension. So the idea came, I mean, Prabhupada, he wanted them to become devotees. He even sent the message that if you become devotees, you don't have to pay your rent, right? And some of them were pretty devotional. There was Mr. Menon, who had a place in the back, and he would come every day to Bhagavatam class. He was Malayali from Kerala, and he had a great affinity for Bhagavatam. And he loved Giriraj Swami a lot. And he was such a nice man. When Prabhupada was in Mauritius, he was involved in a car accident, and he hurt his leg. After that, he started using the cane. So it was difficult for him to go up the steps. And Mr. Menon was living on the ground floor, and Prabhupada's apartment was on the first floor. So Mr. Menon, Giriraj Swami said, look, Swamiji has to come. And he immediately agreed, okay, I'll move upstairs, and Prabhupada can take this downstairs flat, so he doesn't have to go up and down. So some of them were nice, but then some of them were a little antagonistic. So they didn't become devotees. So the idea was that we'll remove the tenants and make the extension of Hare Krishna land what they call heaven on earth. And that way we can utilize the whole property in the service of Krishna. So that's another part two of the story. Somebody can write that book also, how we got the tenants out. Prabhupada showed by his example that if one strictly follows bhakti yoga, one is not touched by the modes of nature, by Maya. Krishna says in the 5th chapter, 3rd verse of Bhagavad Gita, he calls it Nitya Sanyasi. So that refers, Nitya Sanyas means always renounced. Always renounced refers to always having the idea that whatever I'm doing is for the pleasure of Krishna. It's not on my own. That's Nitya Sanyasi. Of course, we think of sannyasi with the danda and saffron cloth, and that's there. That's the order of sannyas. But what Krishna is talking about is actually, he's further explaining from 5.2 what it means to be a karma yogi, or to be in devotional service. It means nitya sannyasi. It means that you're always renouncing whatever you're doing for the pleasure of Krishna. And that was Prabhupada. He set by his example. He was faithful in Krishna consciousness, and all his problems had been adjusted. Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita that if one surrenders unto him, one easily overcomes all problems. The devotee understands that the problems of Maya can be overcome by surrendering to Krishna, by surrendering to the orders of Krishna's representative, the spiritual master. Now that the land was ISKCON's, Prabhupada could proceed to enact his vision. In attempting to construct the buildings and propagate Krishna consciousness, he would meet many more Maya-created problems, no doubt. But the greatest struggle had been won. The gorgeous temple of Shri Shri Radha Ras Bihari would be manifest. In the future, devotees and guests could come to India's gateway and stay in a first-class hotel at Hare Krishna land and conveniently imbibe the spiritual atmosphere of the temple and the devotees, as long as they did not forget Prabhupada's example and instruction, could successfully utilize the facility in the spirit of service to Krishna. The price Prabhupada had to pay in tolerance and dependence on Krishna would never go in vain. What Srila Prabhupada produced by his tolerance was that not only the facilities and the ongoing mission at Hare Krishna land, but a monumental living example of the behavior of a sadhu. In Srimad Bhagavatam, Lord Kapila Dev describes that the sadhu, Tatikshava Karunika Surida Sarvadehinam Ajata Kshatravaha Shanta Sarva Sadhubhushanam. The symptoms of a sadhu are that he's tolerant, merciful, and friendly to all living entities. He has no enemies. He is peaceful. He abides by the scriptures, and all his characteristics are sublime. I'll read that again. The symptoms of a sadhu are that he's tolerant, merciful, and friendly to all living entities. He has no enemies. He is peaceful, and he abides by the scriptures, and all his characteristics are sublime. Srila Prabhupada ki, Shri Shri Radha Ras Bihari ki, Shri Shri Radha Ras Bihari Mandir, Nitai Gaur Premanandi. Any questions, comments?
Thank you, Prabhuji, for sharing insights in Prabhupada Lilamrit. Prabhuji, we have heard that C company, one more company, Mr. Nair, sold this land.
Yeah.
So how Prabhupada dealt with them?
It doesn't elaborate so much on that, but he had meetings with them and convinced them that does not make a claim on the property. He convinced them. Just like he convinced Mrs. Nair to cooperate. Srila Prabhupada was working on a spiritual platform. And we don't really have experienced that so much. We work kind of on a material platform. We see things in terms of, this one is my friend, this one is my enemy. Prabhupada didn't have friends and enemies. He's not seen friends and enemies. He's seen everyone equal as a part and parcel of Krishna. Right? And we fight because of our own ego. Srila Prabhupada fights because of Krishna, for Krishna's pleasure, for Krishna's reputation, for his pleasure. And so we don't really so much understand how Prabhupada deals and how Krishna deals with Srila Prabhupada. but people would become enlightened just by his presence. That's why Mrs. Nair broke down crying, because she was in front of a real sadhu, right? Someone who didn't have friends and enemies, who was equal to everyone. Although she fought like anything, for Prabhupada, Mrs. Nair was still like his daughter. So I don't really have first-hand information about Company C, but I'm sure that Srila Prabhupada, by his Krishna consciousness, convinced them to not make an issue. So from those days when nobody used to come here, it's kind of like that now, like those days, because nobody's coming here. So you get a first-hand experience what Hare Krishna land was like in 1972 and 73 and 74. Nobody came here. Nobody. Some few people sometimes would come and see Radha Ras Bihari, you know, on their morning walk, they'd stop by and see. Otherwise, no. So we're getting a first-hand experience now during this lockdown of what it was like then. Nobody. But then after the temple opened, amazing transformation took place. So many people come to see Radha Ras Bihari. I used to just be flabbergasted by how many people would come here to see Radha Ras Bihari. Right? Now I may be fool number one, and I don't know that this is God, but everybody can't be fool number one, and right? Why people are coming? They come with so much trouble. They come by train, they come by car, the taxi, to see Shri Radha Ras Bihari. They're not a statue. It's God. They're God. And all these people know that. They're getting some reciprocation. If this COVID thing was over, you know, lakhs of people would again start coming here. Why? To see Shri Radha Ras Bihari. Right? We're spending every day so much money for feeding and dressing and offering garlands, right? Not because of the statue. They're not statue. They're God. And that people pick up on. And they come. They come to see God. Right? But in those early days, no, not many people were coming. Gradually it happened. Srila Prabhupada had the vision. Srila Prabhupada had the foresight and understanding and information from Krishna, direct, what to do, what not to do. Similarly, if we follow his good example by dedicating our lives to the service of Krishna, we can get that kind of empowerment from Srila Prabhupada and Krishna. Hare Krishna. Hare Bol.